Now, this morning, I said that I'd begun going to talk about Micah chapter 6, but I saw yesterday, actually, I saw a plaque in the window of the store, the CEI bookstore. We went down there to pick up the extra books that we needed for our class. And we do have them, by the way. If you weren't in class this morning, you're usually in class and you don't have a book, the books are down here. We have some extra ones now. I saw a plaque there, and it was a plaque that said, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord," in Joshua 24, and I think I put 14:60, verse 15. But it did more than that. Now, the reason I'm using it is because it did more than that. You know, this is a popular saying. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." What does it mean? Well, let me tell you something. In my bedroom, there is a plaque that has that written on it. And a lot of people out front of their houses, they have those words written in front of their house. And it's kind of a motto for the people who live there. So while this verse has made its way to many a yard, many a house, do we really think about what responsibilities declaring it as our motto brings with it? Or is this just another empty saying that we repeat without really thinking about what it means? Does it just sound good? You know, a lot of things we say, I think, just because it kind of sounds good. We don't really think too much about it. If somebody says, "How you doing?" You say, "I'm doing fine." Well, you know, that's kind of the normal response. We don't even stop to think about it. And I don't guess the people really want us to give them a rundown about how terrible things are financially. The economy is in a mess. We're not making much money, and our health is terrible. We can't make enough money to make up for our medical expenses. They probably don't want to hear that anyway. So we just say, "I'm fine." But understand that when you put this motto out there, that it's a real statement of principle. And so it means something. So I want to ask you what it means. Now, specifically, I'm applying this to your family because most of the people who would put this sign up kind of saying that when you enter this premises, that this is the motto that we live by. "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." So we're going to talk a good deal about what it means within a relationship, within a family relationship. And we're going to do this very, very, very quickly because of the fact that we have kind of talked a little bit and have a lack of time this morning. You know, the first thing that you think about, I think about, and I read this sign and I thought, boy, this is just great. And I thought, I want to share it with you, is the fact that one of the things we need to be is honest. Most people, that is probably at the top of their priority list when you deal with them. Honesty. I mean, probably everything else in your dealings with people is going to come under that. That's going to be right at the top. Proverbs chapter 12 and verse 2 says something, and the King James, is the way it's translated, is not quite as effective as other translations like the New American Standard and the New International Version. "A man shall not be established by wickedness, but the fruit of," I'm reading the wrong one. "A good man obtaineth favor of the Lord, but a man of wicked devices will he condemn." Now, rather than wicked devices, other translations use the word craftiness. "But a man of craftiness will be condemned." What do you think of when you think of the word crafty? Well, you think of a word that's trying to sell you a bill of goods. That's what you think of. You think, here's a person that's trying to sell you a bill of goods. That they're not really honest with you. And sometimes I fear that you have a little bit of that problem in our country because we hear all these, you know, one of the difficulties we have, marriages have a lot of problems within them. But one of the big problems is that in our society we have really taught that marriage is a confrontational relationship. That it's not a become one flesh, we're unified, we go in the same direction. That we have really been taught, and if you look at all the TV shows you see, and you read the books that you read, and you look at the things that you see, and when people are making conversation at work, it's kind of like, well, my wife, you know, is trying to get everything belongs to her, and I'm trying to get everything belongs to me, and and it's kind of a competition. And that's the way we look at it. Well, when that happens, it's kind of like this. Brian played a lot of baseball. I've coached a little baseball, been around a lot of baseball. The one thing that most people don't understand about baseball more than any other one thing is a balk. If an umpire ever calls a balk, most people in the stands go, "What?" Well, a balk is when you make an unlawful move in order to gain an advantage to throw someone out who's on base, usually at first base, sometimes second, seldom at third. But you know how I define a pick-off move? A pick-off move is the pitcher who can balk without being caught. That's really what the best pick-off move is. He probably is violating the rule, but the umpire just can't quite catch him. Now, Tommy kind of grinning. He probably agrees with that. That's probably true. I mean, he's trying to get as close as he can. Well, we can't be like that in our homes. We can't be like we're trying to pull the wool over one's eyes and just kind of gain an advantage over them. It just cannot happen. We have to have that one flesh idea and be unified. And if you believe that, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, the first thing you need to decide is, I'm going to be honest in my dealings with people. I'm not going to try to deceive them. I'm not going to try to pull the wool over their eyes. I'm not going to try to gain an advantage by wicked devices. I'm not going to be crafty. I'm just going to be plain honest. The second thing is we need to do our best. Now, one of the problems you have is that a lot of people have this idea, if they go to work, they try to really work and they try to put all their effort into it and they want their boss to be impressed. But then if you get home, not so much. Start thinking about raising children, you start thinking about your relationship with your wife, and you just don't pay too much attention to it. 1 Corinthians 16 is an interesting passage that you ought to think about. If you really believe within your home, the motto is, for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. Let me tell you what the Lord said. Watch ye, stand fast in the faith, and then there are two statements made that you need to pay attention to. The word is quit you like men, but it doesn't mean quit. It means to act like men and be strong. It means you need to put the effort into something to accomplish the best possible outcome. That's what it means. Now, he's talking about the Lord's work, I realize that. But that translates into everything that we do that's a part of our relationship with God. And a part of that is being a husband, being a wife, being a child, being a parent. That we need to do our best, and a lot of folks don't. A lot of folks are content to let their husband do his best, but they don't really care about doing theirs. Or a lot of folks are content to let their wife do their best, but I don't care about mine. We've got to understand that. We are the one that's responsible for ourselves. We're going to have to put effort into it. And if your motto is, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, then it means you're going to put some effort into it. That you're not going to try to, as we sometimes say, skate through it. You're just not. The third thing that I would say is this. Galatians chapter 6 and verse 2 says, bear you one another's burdens and so fulfill the law of Christ. Now, we do pretty well with that most of the time if you're talking about folks outside our homes. In other words, we see someone who's a neighbor or who's a member of the church and they have a problem, and we kind of hasten over to help them out. How do we do in our homes? I mean, your husband, your wife, your children, your parents. Do you give them the same consideration that you give other people? Now, if you're saying, if this house is ruled by this principle, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, meaning that our house is guided by God's direction, is that what you're doing? Or do you even pay any attention? Do you even notice that there's a problem, that someone really is struggling and you need to kind of put your arm around them and say everything will be all right or something to that effect? Do you? Within your home, is that something that would be characteristic of it? The fourth thing is this. So we're going to talk about Micah 6 next week. Micah chapter 7. I always have a problem with the minor prophets. I've memorized them many times, but I still have trouble turning to them. So hopefully we can find it when the time comes to find it. In Micah chapter 7 and verse 18, you have the inspired writer talking about God and how He deals with man. And he asked the question of us comparing ourselves with God when he said, who is a God like unto thee that pardoneth iniquity and passeth by the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He retaineth not his anger forever, because he delighteth in mercy. Is that characteristic of your relationship within your home? Or do you keep a logbook? Do you have a small black book somewhere, either figuratively or literally, where you write down everything that displeases you, and you never forget that, and when the time comes that you're ready to call that back to the forefront and use it in argumentation again? Which is it? Now, what he's talking about is God. Micah's talking about when the people turned away from sin, came back to God, and how He forgave them. And in this case, you have the people who went into Babylonian captivity because they completely turned to idolatry. But when they came back, God forgot that. I didn't mean He forgot it in the sense He didn't remember it. Obviously, He remembered it, but He didn't hold it against them. I mean, if our motto is, for me and my house we'll serve the Lord, well, the Lord, when He forgives people, He doesn't file that for future reference. So that the next time that something happens, He can go back and recall it. And we should not within our families as well. We need to be kind and tender-hearted. You know, I used this illustration a few times before. Many years ago, I was putting a countertop in a house in Columbia. Barry Brown was the fellow who was working with me at the time. Barry and I went over this people's house, and it was rather late at night because we were doing a bunch of stuff, and we went over there rather late in the afternoon, and everybody gotten home from work, and we were getting it put in. And this man had a little boy about 6 years old. And I don't know, I've not seen many people more unkind or less tender-hearted than this man, because it was Valentine's Day. And this little boy had made a valentine at school that day. And I don't remember the exact words, but something to the effect of his son was trying to put it in front of me. Get out of my way, son, I'm trying to watch TV. And Barry and I would always laugh about that. From then on, we'd talk about him being Mr. Compassionate. I mean, you know, his son, and we were, the whole time he was there, that's the way it was all the time. There was no kindness, no tenderheartedness. It was like, if I could just take a fly swatter and exterminate him, I would. That was almost the way that it was. And the poor little boy was a sweet little kid, like any other kid. And I see a lot of people treat their wives like that. I see a lot of people treat their husbands like that. Sometimes I may. We need to understand that we need to be kind and tenderhearted. Now, if we are going to say that as for me and my house we'll serve the Lord, what does that mean? Does that mean just we're going to go to church on Sunday? Or does that mean we need to create our relationship within our home to be like God's relationship with His people? Which does it mean? We need to comfort one another. You know, Paul said, and I know that some of these are overlapping, and I realize it, but you know, I'm using the other man. I didn't cull anything he had on the plaque. I took it off. In 1 Thessalonians chapter 4 and verse 18, in fact, Pat talked about going back in buying it, but we didn't. But anyway, when Paul got through with his statement there to the people at Thessalonica about death and how that it's really not as bad as it might appear, because those people, if they've lived righteously, will one day be reunited with those who are righteous. He uses those words, wherefore comfort one another with these words. You know, we need to comfort people. We need to comfort people within our home. As we said earlier in talking about bearing other people's burdens, sometimes we kind of apply that outside, but we need to apply that inside. I mean, a lot of things happen that really upset folks, and they need to be comforted. And you need to just try to say something to help them. Of course, sometimes some people are better at that than others, but we need to try to have that attitude that people can see that we really are concerned, that we really care. That we want to do whatever we can, say whatever we can, that might offer them some encouragement. God does that constantly. And as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, is your motto for your home, then that needs to be present within your home. And you need to learn to keep your promises. A lot of times people make promises they have no intentions of keeping. The only thing that they're doing is they're making a statement that's a promise that kind of gets people off our back. That we just, if somebody says something to us, yeah, okay, I'll do that later. And we have no intention of doing that. And that really becomes a point of contention a lot of times within marriages and within homes where folks say things that they don't really intend to do. It kind of goes back to that word, be honest. But in this particular case, it applies to a specific thing. And it's interesting that in chapter 4 and verse 21, he says, being fully persuaded, and he's talking about God. What he had promised, he was able also to perform. Now you think about it. He's talking about Abraham. And he's saying God made promises to Abraham. They weren't idle promises. He promised that He would give him a son. Abraham was 75 years old, but he did. At 100, that son came. He promised that He would give His people a land. Well, Abraham was dead and gone by the time it happened. But he did fulfill that promise. He promised He'd make of them a great nation. Well, it took several years more for that to occur. 450 more years after they had kind of become a nation, become a people rather, that they became a nation. And they were delivered from Egyptian bondage and came into the land of Canaan. God fulfilled every promise that He made. He didn't just make promises just to make people happy. He didn't just make promises just to get people off His back. He made promises that He intended to keep. And if your home is a place that you're saying, as for me and my house, we'll serve the Lord, then I'll tell you something. You need to pay attention to that. You need to be supportive of one another. How many things are there that people do that you really could care less about? You know, just as a good illustration, I used to fish in bass tournaments. Now, I'm pretty sure that if you asked Pat about that, she probably could have cared less one way or the other. But she was always very supportive of that. Now, that meant I had to sometimes take off a day's work. Sometimes I had to get up 2:30 in the morning. That kind of interfered with a lot of things. But she was always supportive of that. Does she care about it? Probably not. But the fact is, you have to kind of learn that, you know, you need to be supportive of other people, and you're not always going to be in absolute agreement with them. You know what Paul said, and he's referring back to the words of Jesus. This is a quotation from Jesus that is not given in either accounts of the gospel, either Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. He says, I've shown you in all things how that so laboring you ought to support the weak. Now, he's not talking about altogether with physical things, although that's involved in it, but he's supporting the weak would be more than that. And remember the words of the Lord Jesus, how He said it's more blessed to give than to receive. Sometimes we are prone within our homes to say, well, you don't support me. Well, you know what we need to learn is it's more blessed to give than to receive. And even if sometimes somebody doesn't reciprocate as well as they ought, we're still going to be better off if our house is going to be one in which the Lord is respected, that we're going to act like the Lord, and we're going to be supportive, even though sometimes those things might not appear to be very important. You know, I remember a gentleman, I'm not going to tell you who it was, years ago, that was always very supportive of other people and other people's children, and things he didn't really care about. I don't care if you're talking about baseball, football, whatever. But his own children, he never was supportive of them in anything, as far as I could tell. Very opinionated and really didn't care. Now, I'm telling you, you need to realize that the same responsibility you have to people outside, you have responsibility to people within, to your children, to your wife, to your parents. That you have the same responsibility. You have to treat them in the same way you would others. So if you're going to be supportive of other people as a gesture of goodwill, then certainly is that for me and my house we'll serve the Lord is your motto. You're going to do that within the home. And you need to be true to each other. Now, I took this passage and I thought about it. In fact, I started to reject this point because I read it and I thought about it and I thought about it and I said, I don't really get that. Then I began to realize the point he's trying to make. Be true to each other. This is in the book of Revelation, chapter 15, this is one of the signs that John saw there in heaven. The 7 angels and the 7 last plagues that he's showing it. He said, I saw as it were a sea of glass mingled with fire, and them that had gotten the victory over the beast, and over his image, and over his mark, and over the number of his name, stand on the sea of glass having the harps of God. And they sang the song of Moses, the servant of God, and the song of the Lamb, saying, Great and marvelous are thy works, Lord God Almighty, just and true are thy ways, thou King of kings. Now what he's talking about there, if you look at the last part of that, is that these people had been criticized, they had been persecuted, all kinds of things had been done to them, but God was true to them. Now, sometimes there's an old saying that we say that you don't kick somebody when they're down. That's kind of what this passage is saying. You're true to people, no matter what. Sometimes when their problems arise, we're ready to run and hide, and we don't really want to be there. Well, understand that's the time that you're probably the most needed. Now, your child or your husband or your wife may be in a bad state of affairs, but you need to be true to them. And whatever the situation is, you have a relationship with them. And you need to honor that. You need to respect that. Just as God did these. These people had nothing to offer to God. But no matter. God maintained the same relationship with them, despite what might have happened in these situations. That kind of goes back to what James said over there in James chapter 2, where he talks about a person coming in who is poor and you need to treat him just as well as the folks who have. What he's saying is that, you know what, you need to be true to folks. You need to be true to them. You need to respect them and to demonstrate that in the way that you deal with them. And you need to look after each other. Within the home, sometimes you kind of get the idea that, I just kind of take care of myself and everybody else takes care of their self. Well, you have to be careful. In the 15th chapter of the book of Deuteronomy, in verse 11, and this is, of course, the repeating of the law of Moses, and he's talking about how you would treat the poor. But if you treat the poor this way, obviously you'd have the same obligation to members of your family. For the poor shall never cease out of the land. Therefore I command thee, saying, Thou shalt open thine hand wide unto thy brother, to thy poor, to thy needy in thy land. Let me ask you a question. Who is the poorest person on the face of the earth? An infant. What does an infant possess? Nothing. A few diapers and maybe a change of clothes. Everything else they're dependent upon someone else for. Everybody. Everything. I mean, you're talking about the poorest of the poor. Within the home, we have obligations. I mean, we've got to learn that we need to look after each other. We've got to pay some attention. Sometimes you get into this conflict, and I know this is overlapping with other areas, but it really needs to be said sometimes, that it's kind of interesting to me when you see some guy and he's got most of you will not appreciate this, but I'm going to state facts according to current financial situation. He has a $76,000 bass boat. That's what it costs to buy a 22-foot bass boat pretty well equipped. $76,000. A $62,000 truck. That's about what it's going to cost to get a truck that's capable of pulling that $76,000 bass boat. Rod and reels that cost an average of $240 a piece. And then his wife says, you know what, we need to buy a new couch. Just think about that. Just let that sink in a little, and I think you'll understand the point I'm making. We need to look after each other. And men sometimes think we're picking on them, but the bass boat I just can't quite overlook. I saw one the other day and thought, boy, I'd like to have that, but I don't think I have $76,000 to buy one. And you need to treat each other as you treat friends. We would apply Matthew 7 and 12, which is what we sometimes call the golden rule, to our relationship with other people. If they weren't friends, but particularly we apply it to friends. Sometimes when your children come home and they're talking about their friends and what they've done, this is what you quote to them. You tell them, say, you know what? You need to do unto others as you have them do unto you. This passage doesn't exactly say that, but that's a paraphrase of it. Whatsoever ye would that men should do to you, do even so to them. For this is the law and the prophets. Well, if we're going to tell our children that you need to treat your friends that way, then it seems to me like if we're going to say that it's me and my house will serve the Lord, then everybody within the family needs to treat each other like that. You ever thought about how much smoother your family would run if everybody treated every other person like they wanted to be treated? Just think of how much better it would be and how harmonious it would be. Now, the problem is that we're human beings, and it's probably not going to happen all the time. But if we're going to try to make ourselves what God would have us to be, it seems to me like we have to put some effort into it and try to say, okay, this is not just something that applies to people out in the world or to my friends. This applies to members of my family, my husband, my wife, my parents, my children. And we need to love one another deeply from the heart. Proverbs, 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 22 has sometimes people think this kind of lesson is not a scriptural lesson, it's just too touchy-feely. Well, let me tell you something. That's not true. What he says in this case is, he said, seeing you have purified your souls in obeying the truth of the Spirit and the unfeigned love of the brethren. See that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. You see what he's saying? That it kind of goes back to what we said in the beginning of our lesson. That sometimes people will say, as me and my house will serve the Lord, and that's just a saying that they repeat because it sounds good. Well, it seems to me like Peter must understand that's a temptation that we have, just to repeat things because it sounds good. That we say that we've obeyed the truth of the unfeigned love of the brethren. Well, if you say that you've done that, see that you love one another with a pure heart fervently. If you're going to make the claim, then you have to, in fact, carry through with it. If you're going to walk the walk, you have to, talk the talk, you have to walk the walk, as we say in modern times. We need to keep in mind that the commandments of God apply within our families as well as without. And I think that's a problem everybody has. I think most people have a problem that when it comes to family relationships, it's kind of like all's fair and love and war and all bets are off. That's kind of the attitude they have. Understand this, that if you're saved, that it's me and my house will serve the Lord, when you come into that house, you're going to have to serve the Lord just like you do when you're outside that house. And I think that's an important point for us to remember. If you don't serve God within your house, there's one other problem you have. Just think of the message you send to the world. How many people have you known who the church respects as just being tremendous leaders within the church, and then you go home with them one time and you're very disappointed because their home life not what you would expect it to be? I have someone that I know very well. When I began preaching, at the time that I began preaching, he had just been involved in a divorce where his wife divorced him. And he was a preacher that spent a whole lot of time in gospel meetings, writing books and visiting and going everywhere. Had several kids. And he told me one time, he said, you know what you need to learn? He said, you know what I didn't learn was that I spent all my time preaching and I didn't realize and didn't stop to think I had a family at home. Had obligations there. And he was pretty well right, because when you look at that family now, it had a lot of problems. And you would think a person that's involved, and he was in the Lord's work, would never have that. But he was saying, you know what? You're a parent. You're a husband. Yeah, that's me and my house will serve the Lord. But you have to serve the Lord at home too. And that's the lesson sometimes that people forget. I don't know if you're as impressed with that little sign as I was. But you can see I read it, a little sign, had those few things written on it. And I spent 25 minutes talking about it. So it impressed me a great deal. We're going to sing a song of encouragement. We have not had a first principle sermon, but if you need to repent and be baptized from remission of sins, we certainly always give you that opportunity. And if as a Christian we've not served God in a faithful way that's been noted by others, then certainly we'll give you an opportunity to ask God for His forgiveness and our prayers. So together we'll stand as we sing.